October in Boston brings that particular kind of cold that seeps into your bones before you realize it's happening, the kind that makes you walk faster without meaning to, hunching your shoulders against wind that cuts through cheap fabric like it's not even there. I'd been sitting in the Boston Public Library for 6 hours straight, my laptop screen burning into my retinas as I worked through another batch of technical translations, legal documents about pharmaceutical patents that paid 12 cents per word and required absolute precision. My back ached from the wooden chair. My eyes stung from staring at dense Italian medical terminology. But I couldn't afford to stop. Not when the monthly payment on Dad's remaining medical bills was due in 5 days, and I was still $200 short. The library closed at 8, the fluorescent overhead lights flickering twice as a warning, before the librarian made her rounds, gently informing the stragglers that it was time to pack up. I saved my work, backed it up twice because paranoia had become second nature after losing an entire day's work to a corrupted file last month, and gathered my things into the canvas tote bag that had seen better days. The handles were fraying, the fabric stained with coffee from a spill 3 weeks ago, but it carried my laptop and notebooks, and that was all that mattered. Outside, the temperature had dropped at least 10 degrees since I'd entered that afternoon. My jacket, a thin olive green windbreaker I'd bought at a thrift store 2 years ago, did absolutely nothing against the October chill. I tucked my hands into my pockets and started the walk toward the subway station, calculating in my head whether I could afford the fare or if I should save the $2.50 and just walk the 40 minutes back to my kitchenette in Allston. The math wasn't encouraging. Walk it was. I'd made it maybe 3 blocks when I heard the crying, a sound that cut through the ambient noise of traffic and distant conversations, desperate and frightened in a way that made me stop, despite my exhaustion and the cold and my desire to just get home and collapse. An elderly woman stood on the corner of Beacon and Charles Street, right at the edge of Beacon Hill, where the historic brick townhouses gave way to more commercial buildings, and she was crying in a way that suggested complete disorientation, turning in slow circles as people streamed past her without stopping, without even slowing down, because this was Boston, and minding your own business was practically a sport. I shouldn't have stopped. I had my own problems, my own exhaustion, my own desperate situation, but something about the way she clutched her elegant purse to her chest, the quality of her clothing suggesting wealth and care, the pure terror in her eyes as she looked around at a world that had suddenly become incomprehensible, made me walk over to her. "Excuse me," I said gently, touching her arm so softly it was barely contact. "Are you all right? Are you lost?" She turned to me, and the relief that flooded her face was immediate and devastating. And then she started speaking in rapid Italian, words tumbling over each other so fast I had to focus completely to catch them. My Italian was good, fluent even after studying it through college and maintaining it with evening classes I could barely afford. But she was speaking with a thick regional accent that took me a moment to place, somewhere north, maybe Milan or Como. "Ma'am," I said carefully, switching to Italian myself, letting the language flow naturally despite how exhausted I was. "Breathe, you're safe. Tell me what happened." Her name was Bianca, she told me between gasps and tears, and she'd been walking with her son. They'd been looking at the historic buildings because she'd just arrived from Italy, and everything was so different here, so overwhelming. And then he'd taken a phone call and stepped away, and she'd seen something. A shop window, maybe. And when she'd turned around, he was gone. She couldn't remember his phone number. Couldn't remember the address of where they were staying. Couldn't remember anything, except that she was lost, and everything was wrong, and she needed to find her son. The rain started then, just a light drizzle at first, but quickly building into something more substantial. Cold drops that plastered my hair to my head and made Bianca's tears indistinguishable from rainwater. I took off my jacket without thinking and draped it over her shoulders. It was inadequate, but better than nothing, and opened my cheap convenience store umbrella to hold over both of us. "What's your son's name?" I asked, keeping my voice steady and calm, even though I was shivering now in just my thin sweater. "Do you remember what he looks like?" "We can ask people if they've seen him." "Christopher," she said, the English name sounding strange with her accent. "Alto, dark hair. He's so handsome, my Christopher. But I don't remember. She was getting agitated again, her breathing becoming rapid and panicked, and I recognized the signs of a possible anxiety attack or worse. I needed to keep her calm, needed to find help, needed to do something other than stand on this street corner watching this elegant elderly woman fall apart in the rain. "Okay, here's what we're going to do," I said, still in Italian, still keeping that calm, steady tone that I'd learned from 3 years of caring for my father when he was dying, when panic helped no one. And steady calm was the only thing that kept situations from spiraling completely out of control. "We're going to go into that cafe right there, get you somewhere warm and dry, and we'll call the police. They'll help us find your son." But even as I was saying it, I saw them, the black SUVs appearing seemingly out of nowhere, 3 of them moving with synchronized precision to block off the street, and men in dark suits were emerging before the vehicles had fully stopped, spreading out with military efficiency, clearly searching for something or someone. One of them spoke into what had to be a radio or earpiece, his eyes scanning the crowd with intensity that made my stomach tighten with sudden anxiety. Then I saw him, the man who had to be Christopher, stepping out of the lead vehicle with an authority that made people instinctively move out of his way. He was tall, exactly as Bianca had said, maybe 6'1" or 2, with dark hair swept back from a face that was all sharp angles and controlled intensity. He wore a black suit that probably cost more than 6 months of my rent, and even from a distance I could see the barely contained panic in his movements, the way his dark eyes swept the street with desperate precision. "Is that him?" I asked Bianca quietly, and she gasped, new tears flowing. "Christopher. Yes, that's my Christopher." The men in suits had spotted us, or rather spotted Bianca, and they were converging on our position with speed that was frankly intimidating. I instinctively stepped slightly in front of Bianca. Not that I could actually protect her from anything, but the movement was automatic, protective. Christopher Ravalini, because that had to be who he was, reached us first, and up close he was even more striking and more terrifying. Dark brown eyes that were almost black focused on his mother with relief so intense it was almost painful to witness. And then those eyes cut to me, assessing me in maybe 2 seconds flat, taking in everything about me, my wet hair, my inadequate clothing, the way I had my cheap jacket draped over his mother's shoulders, the umbrella I was still holding over her head despite the fact that I was now thoroughly soaked. "Mama," he said, and his voice was deep and controlled, but I could hear the emotion underneath it, barely contained fear and relief warring with each other. He spoke to her in Italian, rapid questions about whether she was hurt, whether she was okay, what had happened. Bianca launched into an explanation, her words still tumbling over each other. And Christopher listened while also gesturing to his men, issuing quiet orders that had them immediately forming a protective perimeter around us. One of them, a massive guy who looked like he could break me in half without trying, approached with a blanket that was probably meant for Bianca, but Christopher took it and wrapped it around his mother himself, his movements gentle despite his obvious agitation. Then his attention came back to me, those dark eyes focusing with intensity that made me want to step backward, but I forced myself to hold my ground. "You found her," he said, switching to English, his accent slight but noticeable. "You've been taking care of her." It wasn't really a question, but I nodded anyway. She was lost and upset. I just stayed with her until you could find her. He studied me for another long moment, and I felt uncomfortably aware of how I must look, soaked and shivering, obviously broke based on my clothing, clearly exhausted from a long day of work. Whatever he saw made something in his expression shift, though I couldn't quite interpret what. "You speak Italian," he said. "I studied in Florence. I work as a translator. What's your name?" "Hannah. Hannah Mitchell." He repeated my name quietly, like he was memorizing it, then reached into his jacket and pulled out a leather wallet, extracting what looked like a business card. "I need to get my mother home and warm, but I want to thank you properly for what you've done tonight. Please, take this." The card was heavy cream cardstock with just a phone number embossed in dark gold lettering. No name, no company, nothing else. I stared at it, unsure what I was supposed to do with it. "I don't need payment," I said, trying to hand it back. Anyone would have done the same thing. His expression suggested he disagreed strongly with that assessment. Not everyone stops. Not everyone helps. Keep it. Call if you ever need anything. Before I could protest further, one of his men approached, murmuring something in his ear that made Christopher's jaw tighten. He nodded, said something back in Italian too rapid for me to catch, then turned back to me. I need to take her home. But Hannah Mitchell, I remember faces and I remember debts. This conversation isn't over. There was something in the way he said it that sent a shiver down my spine that had nothing to do with the cold and rain. This wasn't a normal grateful son thanking someone for helping his mother. This was something else. Something that felt loaded with implications I didn't fully understand. Christopher helped Bianca into the vehicle himself, taking my jacket from her shoulders and handing it back to me with a nod that might have been respect, or might have been dismissal. I couldn't tell. The wet fabric was cold against my skin as I pulled it back on. The motorcade pulled away with the same precision it had arrived with, and I was left standing on the corner with a business card in my hand and questions spinning through my exhausted brain. I looked down at the card, at the single phone number with no context, then tucked it carefully into my pocket and started walking toward the subway station. I'd saved the $2.50 in fare, I decided. I deserved the ride after that strange encounter. My hands were shaking, though whether from cold or adrenaline or something else entirely, I couldn't quite say. That night, in my tiny kitchenette with its single window looking out at the brick wall of the building next door, I took the card out and stared at it for a long time. Common sense said to throw it away, to forget about the whole strange encounter, to go back to my translations and my bills and my quiet, desperate life of barely making it paycheck to paycheck. But some instinct I didn't quite trust, made me tuck the card into the drawer of my second-hand nightstand instead. I had no way of knowing that 3 days later, that card would change absolutely everything. 3 days passed before the phone call came. 3 days during which I threw myself back into work with the desperate focus of someone trying not to think about something they absolutely should not be thinking about. I took on extra projects, stayed up until 2 a.m. translating technical manuals about industrial equipment, drank too much coffee and ate too little actual food, and tried very hard not to look at the cream-colored business card sitting in my nightstand drawer. Tuesday afternoon found me hunched over my laptop in a coffee shop in Cambridge, working through a contract dispute between an Italian textile manufacturer and an American distributor, when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I almost let it go to voicemail because unknown numbers were usually either spam or bill collectors, and I wasn't in the mood for either. But something made me answer on the 4th ring. Hello? Miss Mitchell? The voice was female, older, with an accent that was distinctly Italian, but softened by years of speaking English. My name is Lucia Ferraro. I'm calling on behalf of the Ravalini family regarding a potential employment opportunity. My heart did something complicated in my chest. I'm sorry. I'm not sure what you mean. Mr. Christopher Ravalini was very impressed with how you helped his mother last week. He has a proposition for you, if you'd be willing to meet and discuss it. Her tone was professional, businesslike, giving away absolutely nothing about what this proposition might entail. What kind of proposition? It would be better discussed in person. Would you be available tomorrow morning, say 10 o'clock? I can send a car to collect you. Every instinct I had developed over 26 years of life screamed that this was a terrible idea, that I should politely decline and forget I ever met Bianca Ravalini and her intense son, that nothing good could come from getting involved with people who traveled with armed security and gave out business cards with no names on them. But the medical bills were piling up, my rent was late again, and my car had started making a noise that suggested expensive repairs in my near future. I can meet, I heard myself say. But I'll take the tea, just give me an address. There was a pause. Then she gave me an address on Mount Vernon Street in Beacon Hill that I immediately recognized as one of the most expensive neighborhoods in Boston. 10 o'clock, Miss Mitchell. Please be punctual. The next morning, I stood outside a 4-story brick townhouse that probably cost more than I would earn in my entire lifetime, with its black iron railings and pristine window boxes still holding the last autumn flowers. The whole street looked like something out of a historical postcard, cobblestones and gas lamps and buildings that dated back to when Boston was barely more than a colonial port town. I checked the address 3 times before finally climbing the stone steps and pressing the doorbell. The woman who answered was in her 50s, with silver-streaked dark hair pulled back in a neat bun and an expression that suggested she'd seen everything and was not easily impressed. She looked me over quickly, taking in my best attempt at professional clothing, black pants that I'd had since college, and a gray sweater that was at least clean and unwrinkled, and nodded once. "Miss Mitchell." "I'm Lucia. Please, come in." The interior of the house was quietly magnificent in a way that made my throat tight. Not ostentatious or showy, but everything was quality, from the hardwood floors that gleamed with care to the artwork on the walls that looked like actual originals rather than prints. The staircase curved upward in an elegant spiral, and through an open doorway I could see a living room with furniture that was probably older than my grandmother. Mr. Ravalini will join us shortly, Lucia said, leading me through the house toward the back. "He's finishing a business call. In the meantime, you can meet Mrs. Bianca." We entered a sunroom that faced a small private garden, and there was Bianca, sitting in a comfortable chair by the window with a book in her lap, looking far more composed than she had 3 nights ago in the rain. She looked up when we entered, and her face transformed with recognition and delight. "The kind girl," she said in Italian, setting her book aside. "You came. Christopher said you would come." I crossed to her, taking the hand she offered, and replied in Italian. "How are you feeling, ma'am?" "Better than when we last met, I hope." "Much better, thanks to you." She squeezed my hand gently. "Sit with me. Tell me about yourself while we wait for my son." Lucia brought tea, real tea in a porcelain pot with cups that matched, and I sat with Bianca and answered her questions about where I'd learned Italian, about my time studying in Florence, about my work as a translator. She was sharp and engaged when focused, asking intelligent questions and laughing at my stories about navigating Italian bureaucracy as a foreign student. But I noticed the moments where her attention would drift, where she'd pause mid-sentence as if forgetting what she'd been saying, where confusion would flicker across her face before she oriented herself again. "Mama, are you interrogating my guest?" The voice came from the doorway, and I turned to find Christopher Ravalini standing there, somehow even more imposing in his own home than he'd been on that rainy street. He wore dark slacks and a white shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows. Less formal than the suit he'd worn before, but no less intimidating. Those dark eyes found mine immediately, holding my gaze with intensity that made me want to look away, and simultaneously made it impossible to do so. "Just getting to know her," Bianca replied with a smile. "She's lovely. You should keep her." "Mama," Christopher said again, but there was warmth in his tone underneath the exasperation. He crossed to kiss her forehead, before turning his full attention to me. "Thank you for coming, Miss Mitchell." "Hannah," I said, standing because it felt wrong to remain seated while he loomed over me, "and I'm not sure why I'm here exactly." Lucia mentioned a proposition. A job offer, actually. "Would you join me in my study? We can discuss it privately." I followed him down the hall to a room lined with bookshelves, a massive desk dominating one side, and comfortable leather chairs arranged near a fireplace on the other. He gestured to one of the chairs, and I sat, hyper-aware of how out of place I felt in this space that screamed old money and power. Christopher didn't sit behind his desk, instead taking the chair across from mine, leaning forward with his forearms resting on his knees. "I had you investigated," he said, without preamble. "After that night. I needed to know who you were, whether I could trust you. The bluntness of it should have offended me, but honestly, given the circumstances, it made a certain horrible sense. And what did your investigation tell you? That you're exactly who you appeared to be." Hannah Mitchell, 26 years old, graduated from Boston University with a degree in Italian literature and linguistics. Studied abroad in Florence for a year. Works as a freelance translator, primarily technical documents. Lives alone in Alston in a studio apartment you can barely afford. He paused. That your father died 6 months ago after a 3-year battle with pancreatic cancer, and that you're still paying off the medical bills from his care. My jaw tightened. That's quite thorough. I'm a thorough person. He studied me for a moment longer. I'm also a person who recognizes value when I see it. My mother needs help, Miss Mitchell. Hannah. She's been diagnosed with early-stage Alzheimer's, brought on by trauma she experienced 5 years ago. She's getting progressively worse, and while we have excellent medical care, what she needs most is someone who can communicate with her in her native language, who can help her feel safe and understood when she gets confused. You want me to be her caretaker? Companion. Translator. Someone to spend time with her, take her on walks when the weather permits, read to her, cook with her on her good days, simply be present when she's having a difficult time. He named a figure that made my breath catch, a monthly salary that was 3 times what I typically earned, with health insurance included. The position would be 4 afternoons a week to start, more if needed as her condition progresses. I stared at him, trying to process what he was offering. That's a lot of money for what amounts to keeping your mother company. My mother's peace of mind is worth considerably more than that to me. His expression remained neutral, but I heard the steel underneath. And frankly, from my investigation, you need the money. This would allow you to pay off your debts, maybe even save something. All I'm asking is that you be kind to an elderly woman who's frightened and confused more often than not these days. Why me specifically? There must be professional caregivers, people with actual training in dealing with Alzheimer's patients. We've tried professionals. 5 different ones over the past year. She doesn't connect with them, doesn't trust them. But she responded to you immediately, felt safe with you. That's not something I can hire through an agency. I looked down at my hands, thinking about the pile of past due notices on my tiny kitchen counter, about the conversation I'd had yesterday with the hospice facility still sending bills for my father's final weeks, about the fact that I'd been eating ramen and peanut butter for 2 weeks because I couldn't afford much else. This job would solve all of that, would give me breathing room I hadn't had in years. What's the catch? I asked, looking back up at him. There's always a catch with offers this good. Something that might have been respect flickered in his dark eyes. Smart. The catch is that you'd be working in my home, which means you'd be exposed to my world. I have security for good reasons. You'd need to sign a comprehensive NDA, agree to background checks, understand that discretion is not optional. What you see and hear in this house stays in this house. What exactly would I be seeing and hearing? The question came out before I could stop it, and his expression hardened slightly. Nothing that would require you to lie to authorities, if that's what you're asking. But I'm a private person with a complicated business, and I value my family's privacy absolutely. He stood, crossing to his desk and pulling out a document. This is the employment contract. It outlines everything: salary, responsibilities, confidentiality requirements, termination conditions. I suggest you take it to a lawyer and have it reviewed before signing. I'm not trying to trap you into anything unethical. I took the contract, flipping through pages of legal language that would take me hours to fully parse. Can I have a few days to think about it? Of course. Take a week if you need it. Though I should mention that my mother has already decided she likes you, and she's been asking when the nice girl who speaks proper Italian is coming back. He walked me to the door, and as I was leaving, he added quietly, I remember debts, Hannah. You helped my mother when no one else would. This is me trying to repay that debt in a way that actually helps you. That's all this is. I nodded, clutching the contract like a lifeline or a trap. I still wasn't sure which, and left the townhouse with my head spinning. I spent the rest of that day reading every word of the contract, making notes, researching what I could about Christopher Ravalini, and finding mostly nothing, just vague references to various business interests and a few society page photos from charity galas, where he appeared in expensive tuxedos looking appropriately wealthy and bored. That evening, I called the one lawyer I knew, a guy I'd gone to college with who now worked at a small firm doing contract review. He read through the document while I waited anxiously, finally giving his verdict that it was surprisingly straightforward and fair, with none of the hidden clauses he'd normally expect from someone clearly trying to hide something. The NDA was comprehensive but not unusual for a high-net-worth individual. The salary was generous but not suspicious, and the termination clause actually favored me more than the employer. Whoever wrote this actually wanted to make sure you'd be protected, he said, sounding almost disappointed that he couldn't find any red flags. I'd take it if I were you. This kind of money doesn't come around often for people like us. People like us. Translation. People who were broke and desperate and couldn't afford to turn down good opportunities just because they came from mysterious sources. I thanked him for his time, paid his reduced rate with money I really didn't have to spare, and sat in my apartment staring at the contract for another hour. The next morning, I called Lucia and told her I'd take the position. She sounded pleased but not surprised, as if my acceptance had been inevitable, and instructed me to come by the following Monday to begin. Christopher, she informed me, had already arranged for the necessary paperwork to be expedited. And just like that, I stopped being a struggling freelance translator barely scraping by, and became something else entirely, though I wouldn't understand exactly what that something else was until much later, when it was far too late to walk away. A month slipped by faster than I expected, measured in afternoons spent in the Ravalini townhouse, in conversations in Italian with Bianca, in quiet routines that became familiar before I realized they were happening. Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday, I would arrive at 10 in the morning and stay until 4 in the afternoon. 6 hours that felt simultaneously like minutes and years depending on what kind of day Bianca was having. The good days were wonderful, filled with her stories about growing up in a small village near Lake Como, about meeting her husband Carlo at a festival when she was 19 and he was 22, about raising 2 children in a world that was both privileged and dangerous in ways she described only obliquely. On those days we would cook together in the kitchen that Lucia allowed us to commandeer, making pasta from scratch the way Bianca's grandmother had taught her, the rhythmic motion of kneading dough becoming almost meditative. We'd read together, Italian poetry mostly, Dante and Petrarca and contemporary writers whose names I'd never heard, but whose words moved Bianca to tears or laughter depending on the passage. The difficult days were harder than I'd anticipated, when confusion would descend on her like fog, and she'd forget where she was, who I was, what year it was. She'd call me Sophia sometimes, Christopher's dead sister, and the pain in her voice when she did made my throat tight. Other times she'd become agitated, convinced that someone was coming to hurt her, that the house wasn't safe, that she needed to leave immediately to find people who had been dead for years. Those days I'd learned to speak softly, to not contradict her directly, to redirect her attention rather than try to force reality on a mind that couldn't quite hold it. Christopher was around more than I'd expected for someone who supposedly ran multiple businesses. He'd appear in the doorway of whatever room Bianca and I were occupying, watching us with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. Sometimes he'd join us for tea in the afternoon, sitting quietly while his mother talked, interjecting occasionally with questions or comments that always seemed carefully calculated to keep her engaged and oriented. Other times he'd simply observe for a few minutes before disappearing again, called away by phone calls or meetings or whatever it was he did when he wasn't being a devoted son. I was acutely aware of him whenever he was near, of the way he moved through his home with absolute confidence, of how the household staff deferred to him with respect that bordered on fear, of the men in dark suits who came and went at odd hours and spoke in voices too low for me to overhear. I told myself it was none of my business, that I was here for Bianca and nothing else, that whatever Christopher did in the other parts of his life was separate from the 6 hours a day I spent in his mother's company. But curiosity is a persistent thing, and observation is hard to avoid when you're paying attention. I noticed the calls he'd take in other rooms, the tension in his shoulders when he returned from them. I noticed the way Lucia would sometimes close doors quickly when I approached certain parts of the house. I noticed the security cameras everywhere, the alarm system that was far more sophisticated than necessary for a residential property, the fact that the windows were thicker than normal glass should be. The dinner happened on a Thursday evening in late November, nearly 5 weeks after I'd started working for the Ravalinis. Christopher had mentioned earlier in the week that he'd be hosting some business associates and asked if I'd mind staying later than usual to keep Bianca company, as the gathering might upset her. I'd agreed without much thought, figuring I'd just rid to her in her room upstairs, while whatever meeting was happening downstairs concluded. What I hadn't anticipated was that Bianca would have one of her worst episodes while the house was full of dangerous-looking men in expensive suits. It started during dinner, which Lucia had prepared and served to the guests in the formal dining room, while Bianca and I ate in the smaller breakfast room off the kitchen. Bianca had been fine initially, chatting about a television program she'd watched that afternoon. But halfway through the meal, she'd suddenly gone quiet, her fork frozen halfway to her mouth, her eyes distant and unfocused. "Bianca," I said softly in Italian, "are you all right? They're here," she whispered, her voice taking on a quality I'd never heard before, hollow and terrified. "They've come for us. They've come to finish what they started. No one's here except family and friends. I tried to reassure her, reaching across to touch her hand. You're safe. Christopher is right downstairs. But she was already standing, pushing away from the table so violently that her chair toppled backward, the crash loud in the quiet room. We have to go. We have to run. They'll kill us all, just like they killed Sophia. There was so much blood, so much. I couldn't stop it. I couldn't save her. She was spiraling into full panic, her breathing coming in gasps, tears streaming down her face as she backed toward the door. I moved slowly toward her, keeping my voice calm and steady, even as my heart raced. Bianca, listen to me. Sophia's gone, yes, but you're safe now. Christopher made sure you're safe. Lies, she spat, the vehemence shocking coming from someone usually so gentle. All lies. Everyone lies. Everyone betrays. They said we'd be protected, and then they shot her. They shot my baby girl. She lunged for the door leading to the main part of the house, and I had no choice but to follow, catching up to her in the hallway, just as she was heading toward the dining room where Christopher and his guests were meeting. I could hear voices from behind the partially closed door, speaking in Italian, discussing something about territories and shipments and consequences that sounded ominous even out of context. Bianca, wait. I tried again, but she pushed past me with surprising strength for a woman her age. She burst into the dining room and I followed helplessly, my stomach dropping as I took in the scene. Christopher sat at the head of a long table, surrounded by perhaps 8 men, all of them going silent as Bianca entered, all eyes turning to assess the interruption. The atmosphere in the room was thick with tension. I'd interrupted something important, and possibly dangerous. Traditori! Bianca screamed, pointing at the men around the table. Betrayers, all of you. You promised protection and delivered death. You took my daughter, my Sophia, my beautiful girl. And for what? For power? For money? For your endless wars? Christopher was on his feet immediately, his face a mask of control, even as I saw the pain flickering underneath. Mama, these men had nothing to do with Sophia. Come, let's go upstairs. But Bianca was past hearing reason, lost in memories that were 5 years old, but playing out in her mind like they were happening now. I saw them. I saw the car. I saw the bullets. I saw my daughter die, and all you did was stand there covered in her blood, doing nothing, saving nothing. The words hit Christopher like physical blows, his composure cracking just slightly, just enough for me to see the devastating guilt underneath. The men around the table looked uncomfortable, shifting in their seats, clearly unsure how to handle this breach of whatever formal protocol governed their world. I moved quickly, stepping between Bianca and the table, blocking her view of the men and forcing her to focus on me. Ma'am, I said firmly in Italian, catching her face between my hands so she had to look at me. I know you're frightened. I know the memories hurt. But right now, in this moment, you need to come with me. The garden, remember? You wanted to see if the roses had survived the frost. Let's go check. It was complete fabrication. There had been no such conversation. But sometimes with Alzheimer's patients, the truth mattered less than providing an anchor to pull them back to the present. Bianca blinked, confusion replacing some of the panic, her breathing still rapid but slowing slightly. The roses? She repeated uncertainly. Yes, the white ones you planted last spring. Come on, let's go see them. I gently took her arm and started guiding her back toward the door, meeting Christopher's eyes briefly as we passed. The gratitude there was intense but fleeting, replaced quickly by professional neutrality as he turned back to his guests with apologies I couldn't quite hear. I led Bianca through the house to the sunroom that overlooked the back garden, turning on the exterior lights so we could see the small space even in the November darkness. The garden was mostly bare now, autumn having stripped most of the greenery, but there were still a few hardy plants clinging to life. Tell me about Sophia, I said quietly, once Bianca had calmed somewhat, sitting beside her on the cushioned bench. What was she like? Bianca's eyes filled with tears, but they were calmer tears now, sad rather than panicked. Beautiful, she said, inside and out. She wanted to be a doctor, wanted to help people. Christopher tried to keep her away from the business, from that world, but she insisted on being involved, said she wouldn't hide while her brother carried the burden alone. Her voice broke. It got her killed. I'm so sorry. I said. Because what else could I say? That's a grief no mother should bear. We sat together in silence for a long time, her head eventually coming to rest on my shoulder, exhaustion from the emotional outburst making her small and frail against me. I heard footsteps in the hall behind us but didn't turn, knowing somehow that it was Christopher, that he was checking on us but wouldn't intrude on this moment. When Bianca finally fell asleep against my shoulder, I carefully extracted myself and found Christopher standing just inside the doorway, his jacket discarded, his shirt sleeves rolled up, tie loosened. He looked more disheveled than I'd ever seen him. More human. Your guests? I asked quietly. Gone. I sent them away. He moved closer, looking down at his sleeping mother with an expression that made my heart ache. I'm sorry you had to see that. Had to handle that alone. I'm not alone. I'm with her. I stood, stretching muscles that had gone stiff from sitting still. She was reliving it, wasn't she? The day Sophia died. He nodded, not meeting my eyes. Car accident, supposedly. Wrong place, wrong time. A message meant for me that hit her instead. His jaw clenched. Mama saw the whole thing. She was in the car with Sophia. Somehow came out without a scratch physically, but mentally. He gestured helplessly. She was never the same. The Alzheimer's started within months. Doctors say trauma can trigger it in people already predisposed. So you blame yourself, I said. Not a question, but a statement of obvious fact. Of course I blame myself. I brought Sophia into this world, this business. I thought I could protect her. Thought having her close meant she'd be safe. I was wrong. He finally looked at me. The guilt is the only thing I'm certain of anymore. The vulnerability in his admission caught me off guard. This wasn't the controlled businessman who'd interviewed me, or the distant employer who observed from doorways. This was someone stripped bare by grief and responsibility. And I recognized the expression because I'd seen it in my own mirror often in the 3 years I'd spent watching my father die slowly, feeling helpless to prevent it. Guilt is the price we pay for loving people we can't save, I said quietly. I spent 3 years watching my father deteriorate from cancer, trying everything, spending money I didn't have on treatments that didn't work, and when he finally died, I felt guilty that I was relieved it was over, guilty that I'd failed him, guilty that I'd survived, guilty that I'd thought maybe I could have tried harder, done more. Christopher studied me with those dark eyes that seemed to see too much. How do you live with it? I don't think you do, really. You just carry it and try to make it mean something. Try to let it make you more compassionate, more present for the people still here. I glanced at Bianca, still sleeping peacefully. She doesn't blame you, you know. The lucid parts of her, when she's herself. She worries about you more than anything else. Worries that you're destroying yourself with this guilt. She said that? Not in those words. But it's there, in how she talks about you. She's proud of you, Christopher. Scared for you, but proud. He was quiet for a long moment, then surprised me by sitting down on the bench where I'd been. His proximity suddenly close enough that I could smell his cologne, something expensive and woody that made me far too aware of him as a man, rather than just my employer. Thank you, he said finally, for what you did tonight, for how you handled her. Most people would have panicked or called for help or stood there uselessly. You just stepped in and brought her back. It's what you're paying me for, I said, trying to keep things professional even as my pulse quickened from his nearness. No, I'm paying you to keep her company and help her feel less alone. What you did tonight was something else entirely. He turned slightly to look up at me. You care about her. It's not just a job to you. He was right, though I hadn't fully acknowledged it until he said it out loud. Somewhere in the past 5 weeks, Bianca had stopped being just my employer's mother and had become someone I genuinely cared about, someone whose good days made me happy and whose bad days broke my heart. Getting attached was probably unprofessional, definitely unwise, but it had happened anyway. She's easy to care about, I admitted. So are you, Christopher said quietly, and the words hung between us heavy with implications neither of us was ready to examine. The moment stretched uncomfortably long before I cleared my throat and stepped back, putting professional distance between us again. It's late. I should probably head home. I'll have someone drive you. I can take the tea, it's fine. It's nearly midnight, and you're a woman alone. You'll let someone drive you home, or I'll do it myself. The authority in his tone made it clear this wasn't negotiable. In the end, one of his security men drove me home in one of those black SUVs that screamed money and danger, and I spent the entire ride thinking about the way Christopher had looked at me in that garden room, about the vulnerability he'd shown, about the fact that I'd called him Christopher instead of Mr. Ravalini, and he hadn't corrected me. I was starting to realize that somewhere along the way, the boundaries between employer and employee, between professional and personal, had begun to blur in ways that should probably concern me more than they did. But as I lay in my narrow bed in my cramped apartment that night, I found I couldn't quite regret the blurring, even knowing it was probably the beginning of something I wasn't prepared for. I discovered the truth about Christopher's world the way most secrets are uncovered, not through dramatic revelation, but through accumulated evidence that suddenly crystallizes into undeniable reality. It happened 2 weeks after the incident with Bianca and the business dinner, on a Tuesday afternoon when I arrived at the townhouse and found the atmosphere different, charged with tension that made the security personnel more alert, the household staff quieter than usual. Bianca was having a good day, which was fortunate because it meant I could focus on the undercurrent swirling through the house rather than managing a crisis. We'd settled in the library, working through a collection of Italian folk tales she wanted to read, when raised voices from Christopher's study down the hall broke through the quiet. The door wasn't completely closed, and sound carried in the old house despite its solid construction. I shouldn't have listened. I knew that even as I found myself straining to hear, but curiosity and concern warred with professional distance, and curiosity won. The conversation was in Italian, rapid and heated, and I caught fragments that made my blood run cold. The shipment was intercepted. A male voice I didn't recognize said, "The Greco family is claiming the territory as theirs now, saying we violated the agreement." "There was no agreement about the waterfront," Christopher replied, his voice hard in a way I'd never heard it. "That's been Ravalini territory for 30 years. They're pushing back, hard. There've been threats, Christopher, against you specifically. Let them threaten. They know what happens when threats become actions." Another voice chimed in, younger, more agitated. "We need to respond now. Make an example. Show them we're not backing down." "And start a war that gets more people killed?" Christopher's voice cut through sharply. "I've had my fill of bloodshed, thank you. We'll handle this strategically, not emotionally." The word bloodshed echoed in my mind as Bianca asked me a question about the story we'd been reading, and I had to force myself to focus, to answer coherently while my thoughts spun. I'd known, intellectually, what Christopher probably was. The NDA and the security and the careful way people treated him had all pointed in one obvious direction. But knowing abstractly, and hearing it confirmed in stark terms about territories and threats and violence were entirely different things. When the meeting broke up 20 minutes later, I heard multiple sets of footsteps heading toward the front door, voices lowering to murmurs I couldn't make out. Bianca had dozed off in her chair, the book fallen into her lap, and I sat frozen trying to process what I'd overheard, and what it meant for me to continue working here. Christopher found me like that, still sitting beside his sleeping mother, staring at nothing while my mind raced. He appeared in the library doorway, and I knew immediately from his expression that he was aware I'd heard at least part of the conversation. His face was carefully neutral, but tension radiated from him in waves. "Hannah," he said quietly. "Can we talk? Privately?" I glanced at Bianca, unwilling to leave her alone even though she was sleeping peacefully. "Lucia is right outside," he added. "She'll stay with Mama while we speak." I followed him to his study, my heart pounding, unsure whether I was about to be fired or warned or something worse. He closed the door behind us and gestured to one of the leather chairs. But I remained standing, needing the small assertion of control. "You heard," he said. "Not a question. Some of it. The walls aren't as thick as you probably think they are." He nodded, moving to the window that overlooked the street, his back to me. "And now you're frightened. Of me. Of this house. Of what being here means. Are you involved in organized crime?" The question came out blunter than I'd intended, but I was tired of dancing around obvious truths. "That's a complicated question with an even more complicated answer." He turned to face me, and the expression on his face was tired, older somehow than his 32 years. My family has been part of a certain world for 3 generations. My grandfather built an empire through means that were sometimes legal and sometimes not. My father maintained it, expanded it. When he died, the responsibility fell to me. That's not an answer. Yes, he said flatly. I run an organization that operates outside the law in many of its activities. Import, export, protection, gambling, other ventures I won't detail because you don't need that knowledge for your own safety. Does that satisfy your need for honesty? My mouth went dry. Hearing him confirm it so directly made it real in a way that suspicion never had. Why tell me this? Why not just fire me and have me sign more NDAs? Because you deserve the truth, and because I won't insult your intelligence by continuing to pretend you haven't figured out what I am. He moved closer. Not threateningly, but with intensity that made me want to step back even as I held my ground. I'm not a good man, Hannah. I've done things that would horrify you if you knew details. I've hurt people. I've ordered actions that resulted in deaths. I've built power on a foundation of fear and violence. But, he paused, as if gathering his thoughts carefully. Everything I do, every decision I make, is calculated to protect the people under my care. My mother, my organization, the neighborhood businesses that rely on us. And now, whether you like it or not, you became part of this world the moment you helped Mama that night in the rain. And more so when you accepted this job. I need you to understand that while you're under my roof, while you're connected to my family, you're safer than you've ever been in your life. But I also need you to understand that there are people out there who would hurt you to get to me if they knew you mattered. Do I? I asked, the words out before I could stop them. Matter, I mean. Something flickered in his dark eyes. More than is probably wise for either of us. The admission hung between us, heavy with implications I wasn't ready to examine. I crossed to one of the chairs and sat down, because my legs felt suddenly unsteady. I should quit. Pack my things and walk away, and pretend I never met your family. You should, he agreed. That would be the smart thing, the safe thing. But you won't. How do you know? Because you're not someone who walks away when things get complicated. You spent 3 years caring for a dying father when you could have placed him in a facility and gone on with your life. You stopped to help lost elderly women in the rain when everyone else just walks past. You stay with my mother through her worst episodes instead of calling for help and stepping back. He leaned against his desk, arms crossed. You see people who need something and you help them, even when it costs you. It's who you are. He wasn't wrong, and I hated that he'd read me so accurately. This is different. This is dangerous. Life is dangerous. You could get hit by a bus tomorrow. At least here, you'll be protected. Protected from threats that only exist because I know you. I shot back. Fair point. He studied me for a long moment. What do you want to know? I'll answer any questions you have within reason. I had 100 questions, but one rose to the surface above all others. The people who killed Sophia. Was that because of your world? His face went carefully blank. Yes. Rival family sending a message. They meant to kill me, got her instead. Mama witnessed it, saw her daughter die in front of her, and that trauma triggered the rapid progression of her Alzheimer's. So you blame yourself for that too. I blame myself for bringing her into this life in the first place. Sophia wanted to be involved, wanted to help run the legitimate businesses, wanted to prove she wasn't just a sheltered daughter. I thought keeping her close meant I could protect her. I was wrong. His voice was flat, emotionless in the way of someone who'd felt too much and had to shut it down to function. And the people who did it? Dealt with. Something cold and final in those 2 words made it clear exactly what dealt with meant. I should have been terrified, should have run for the door and never looked back. But instead, I found myself thinking about Bianca's face when she talked about Sophia, about the grief that had consumed her so completely it had literally damaged her brain. I thought about Christopher's guilt, the way it drove him to hire me specifically because I could give his mother moments of peace. I thought about the complicated nature of morality, about how easy it was to judge from the outside when you'd never been forced into impossible choices. I'm not asking you to approve of what I do, Christopher said quietly, reading something in my expression. I'm just asking you to understand that I'm trying to protect the people I love in the only way I know how. And that includes you now, whether you want it or not. This is insane, I said. But the words lacked conviction. I'm a translator who takes care of your mother. I'm nobody. You stopped being nobody the moment Mama trusted you. The moment I started relying on you to help her through her worst days. You're part of this family now, Hannah. That makes you valuable. And in my world, valuable things need protection. I stood, needing to move, to think, to process everything he was telling me. I need time. To figure out if I can live with this, knowing what I know now. Take all the time you need. But understand that either way, you're going to have security watching you. That's not negotiable. It's not about controlling you. It's about making sure the Greco family or anyone else doesn't decide to use you as leverage against me. The thought sent ice down my spine. Has that been a risk this whole time? A small one, but it's growing. That meeting you overheard? The territory dispute is escalating. The Grecos are pushing boundaries, testing to see how far they can go before I push back. They're looking for weaknesses, for pressure points. If they discover that Mama has a companion she's attached to, if they figure out that I've started... He trailed off, then continued. If they realize you're important, you become a target. Then I should definitely quit. Quitting doesn't make you less of a target if they've already identified you. It just makes you less protected. He moved to stand in front of me, close enough that I had to tilt my head back to meet his eyes. I'm not trying to trap you or manipulate you. I'm trying to be honest about the situation we're both in. You can walk away from this job, but you can't walk away from knowing what you know, from having been part of this household. That knowledge makes you valuable information to the wrong people. So I'm trapped. You're protected, he corrected. There's a difference. Bianca's voice calling my name from the library interrupted whatever I might have said next. Christopher stepped back immediately, the moment broken, and I left his study with my thoughts in chaos, returning to the simple task of reading to an elderly woman who just wanted company and stories, the only uncomplicated relationship in this increasingly complex situation I'd walked into. Over the next 3 days, I went through every argument with myself, every pro and con list, every rational reason I should walk away and never come back. But in the end, I kept thinking about Bianca's smile when I arrived each afternoon, about the way her confusion cleared when she heard Italian spoken with genuine affection, about how she'd grip my hand during her bad days, like I was an anchor to reality. And I thought about Christopher, about the guilt that drove him, about the impossible weight of responsibility he carried, about the brief moments of vulnerability he'd shown me when the mask slipped, and I saw the man underneath the power. 3 days after our conversation, I arrived for my Tuesday shift and found Christopher in the hallway, clearly waiting for me. I'm staying, I said before he could speak. But I need you to promise me something. What? If I'm in danger? If this situation with the Greco family or anyone else gets worse, you tell me. No more keeping me in the dark thinking it's protection. I deserve to know what I'm walking into. He studied me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. That's fair. You have my word. And one more thing. You said I matter to you more than is wise. I need to know what that means. The question hung between us in the quiet hallway, both of us aware that answering it would change everything, would cross a line that maybe shouldn't be crossed between employer and employee, between protected and protector. It means, Christopher said finally, his voice low and intense, that I'm falling for you, Hannah, despite knowing it's complicated and dangerous, and probably a terrible idea for both of us. It means that somewhere between watching you care for my mother and listening to you read Italian poetry and seeing your compassion even when you have every reason to walk away, I started wanting you in my life for reasons that have nothing to do with Mama's needs and everything to do with my own. The admission should have terrified me, but instead it felt like a key turning in a lock, opening something I'd been trying to keep closed. Because the truth was, I'd been falling too, against all logic and common sense, drawn to the complexity of him, to the man who could be ruthless in his business but tender with his mother, who carried crushing guilt but still tried to protect everyone around him. This is a bad idea, I said. Terrible, he agreed. I barely know you. I'm not sure anyone really knows me. But you've seen more of the real me than most people ever do. I should have said no, should have maintained those professional boundaries, should have remembered that he was a criminal, and I was just a woman trying to survive in a world that had suddenly become far more complicated than it should be. But I'd spent 3 years watching my father die, months barely scraping by, years putting everyone else's needs before my own wants. Okay, I heard myself say. Okay, I'm falling too, despite knowing it's complicated and probably a disaster waiting to happen. But yes, I'm falling for you too. The look that crossed Christopher's face was pure relief, mixed with something deeper. Hunger, maybe, or hope. He reached out slowly, giving me time to pull back, and cup my face in his hands, his touch gentle despite the obvious strength in those fingers. This changes things, he said quietly. I know. You're going to see sides of my world you won't like. There will be moments when you question this decision. I'm already questioning it. He smiled then, a real genuine smile that transformed his usually serious face. At least you're honest about it. Then he kissed me, and whatever rational objections I had left dissolved in the heat of it, in the way his mouth moved against mine with barely contained intensity, in the way my body responded like it had been waiting for exactly this moment. When we finally broke apart, both breathing hard, I could hear Bianca calling from the sunroom. Duty calls, I said, my voice shakier than I wanted it to be. Tonight, Christopher said. After Mama's asleep. Have dinner with me. A real conversation, just us. I nodded, not trusting my voice, and went to take care of Bianca, my mind reeling from everything that had just happened, from choices made and lines crossed, from falling into something that felt inevitable and terrifying, and somehow exactly right despite all the reasons it shouldn't be. The weeks that followed my admission to Christopher felt like living in 2 parallel worlds that somehow coexisted without fully touching. In one world, I was Hannah Mitchell, companion to an elderly woman with Alzheimer's, reading Italian poetry in sunlit rooms, cooking traditional recipes, taking careful walks through the Beacon Hill streets when Bianca was having good days. In the other world, I was someone connected to Christopher Ravalini, aware now of what that connection meant, feeling the weight of eyes watching me even when I couldn't see them directly, navigating a relationship that grew deeper despite all the reasons it shouldn't. Christopher and I were careful, discreet in ways that felt both necessary and frustrating. We'd stolen moments together after Bianca went to bed. Late dinners in the townhouse kitchen where Lucia would leave food prepared and then disappear with tactful efficiency. We'd talk for hours about everything and nothing. Him sharing pieces of his history that explained the man he'd become. Me opening up about the years of caring for my father. About dreams I'd set aside. About the loneliness of survival. He'd introduced me to Anthony Marino 2 weeks after we'd acknowledged what was happening between us. Anthony had shown up one evening while Christopher and I were having coffee in the study after Bianca's bedtime. And I'd tensed immediately, recognizing the name from conversations I'd overheard. Anthony was tall, maybe 40, with graying hair at his temples and eyes that assessed me with the wariness of someone whose job was to identify threats. "So you're the translator who's got Christopher acting like a different person," Anthony had said, his tone carefully neutral. "I'm the person who takes care of Mrs. Bianca," I'd replied, matching his tone. "Whatever else I am is between Christopher and me." Something in my response had made Anthony's expression shift slightly. Respect, maybe, or at least acknowledgement that I wasn't going to be intimidated easily. He'd turned to Christopher with a slight smirk. "You picked someone with a spine. That's new. Careful," Christopher had warned. But there was affection underneath the warning. Hannah doesn't take well to being discussed like she's not in the room. Over the following weeks, Anthony had become a semi-regular presence when I was around, initially watching me with that careful assessment, gradually relaxing into something that felt almost like acceptance. He'd shown up one Tuesday afternoon when I was walking Bianca through the garden and had fallen into step beside us, making conversation in surprisingly fluent Italian that delighted Bianca. "He's testing me," I'd said to Christopher later that night, making sure I'm not going to panic or do something stupid. "He's protecting me," Christopher had corrected. "Anthony's been with me since we were teenagers. He's seen what happens when people get close to me and can't handle the reality. He needs to know you're not going to break under pressure." "And what's his verdict?" He thinks you're either remarkably brave or remarkably stupid, and he's not sure which yet. But he likes you, which is significant. Anthony doesn't like many people. The relationship with Christopher continued to develop in those stolen hours, careful touches that became bolder, conversations that became more intimate, the inevitable progression of two people drawn to each other despite complicated circumstances. We hadn't crossed certain lines yet, both of us aware that doing so would change things irrevocably, but the tension between us was constant and electric. Then the surveillance started, and everything shifted into sharper focus. I noticed it first on a Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks after I'd told Christopher I was staying despite knowing the truth. I was leaving the townhouse, heading toward the T station to go home, when I caught sight of the same dark sedan I'd seen parked on the street that morning. Different location, but same car, same tinted windows. I told myself it was paranoia, that Boston was full of dark sedans, that I was seeing patterns that weren't there. But the next day, the car was there again. And this time, I saw someone inside taking photos with a camera that had a lens too long for casual photography. My stomach dropped and I pulled out my phone immediately, calling Christopher, even though I'd normally wait until I was off the clock to contact him. "There's someone watching me," I said, without preamble when he answered. "Dark blue sedan, Massachusetts plates. They've been here 2 days in a row and they're taking pictures." "Where are you right now?" His voice went immediately sharp, focused. "Just left the house, walking toward Charles Street." "Go back inside. Now. Don't look at the car. Don't acknowledge you've noticed. Just turn around and come back." I did as he said, my heart pounding, aware now of how exposed I was on the street, how vulnerable. The townhouse door opened before I reached it, one of Christopher's security men there to usher me inside quickly, and suddenly the house that had felt comfortable and safe felt like a fortress under siege. Christopher appeared within minutes, having clearly been somewhere nearby, his expression controlled, but his eyes hard with anger that wasn't directed at me. He pulled me into his study and closed the door, then immediately made a call, speaking in rapid Italian to someone, issuing orders about checking footage and running plates, and finding out who was watching his house. "How long?" I asked when he hung up. "I don't know yet, but we'll find out." He moved to the window, looking out at the street with the careful attention of someone cataloging every detail. "This is exactly what I was afraid of. The Grecos or someone else figuring out you matter. Maybe they're just watching the house generally, not me specifically. They waited until you left to start taking photos." His voice was flat, stating facts. "They're establishing your routine, learning your patterns. That's threat assessment, Hannah. They're deciding whether you're worth using." The words sent ice through my veins. "What do we do?" "You get security. Permanent, not just when you're here. Someone with you at all times when you're out of this house." He turned to face me. "And before you argue that it's too much or you don't need it, understand that this isn't negotiable." Not anymore. I wanted to argue, wanted to insist I could take care of myself, but the fear trickling through me won out over pride. "Okay, but I can't have obvious security following me everywhere. My neighbors will ask questions. Then they'll be discreet, but they'll be there." He came closer, his hand coming up to cup my face. "I won't let anything happen to you. I promise you that." "You can't promise that. You don't control everything." "No, but I control considerable resources, and every single one of them is now focused on keeping you safe." The intensity in his dark eyes was almost frightening in its absoluteness. "The Grecos want to push boundaries. They just crossed the wrong line." Within 24 hours, I had a security detail. 2 men who worked in shifts. Always there, but maintaining distance. Professional enough that I could almost pretend they weren't following me to the grocery store and library and back to my apartment. Christopher's people had also identified the surveillance team, confirmed they were working for Nicholas Greco, and the information had led to a tense meeting I wasn't privy to, but heard about secondhand from Anthony. "Christopher sent a very clear message," Anthony told me one afternoon when we were both sitting with Bianca while she napped. "The exact wording isn't something you need to know, but the essence was that you're untouchable, and any move against you will be considered a declaration of war. That's going to escalate things, isn't it?" "Probably, but leaving it unaddressed would have been worse. Greco was testing to see if you were a weakness he could exploit." Christopher made it clear you're a line he won't allow to be crossed. The confrontation came a week later, in the form of information that a shipment of Christopher's had been intercepted at the docks, stolen by Greco's people in what was obvious retaliation. Christopher's mood that evening was dangerous. Controlled fury simmering underneath professional calm, and I watched him take call after call in his study, making decisions about responses and consequences in a language I was starting to understand too well. "You should go home," he told me that night after Bianca was asleep. "This is going to get uglier before it gets better." "That's exactly why I'm staying." I moved closer to where he stood by the window. "You said I matter to you." "That works both ways, Christopher. I'm not running just because things got complicated." He turned to face me, and the look in his eyes was raw with emotion he rarely showed. "I'm trying to protect you. I know. But I don't need protection from you, from being here with you. I need protection from the people who want to hurt you through me. There's a difference. Hannah, you don't understand what this world is like when conflict escalates. People get hurt. People die. And I can't guarantee I can keep you completely safe if you're in the middle of it. Then don't keep me in the middle of it," I said, the solution suddenly obvious. "You're worried about me being a target at my apartment, being vulnerable when I'm alone. So don't let me be alone." He stared at me. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting I stay here. Not forever, not permanently necessarily, but until this situation with Greco resolves. I'm here most days anyway with Bianca, and you have security, proper protection. It makes more sense than me going back to an apartment with just 2 guards who can't actually be with me inside. You're asking to move in. I'm asking for the practical solution to the problem you're trying to solve." I held his gaze. "Unless you don't want me here that much. I want you here too much," he admitted. "That's the problem. Once you're here, once you're part of this household completely, walking away becomes harder. For both of us. Maybe I don't want it to be easy to walk away." The admission hung between us for a long moment before Christopher closed the distance and kissed me. And it was different this time. Urgent and hungry and full of weeks of carefully maintained distance finally breaking. When we pulled apart, both breathing hard, his forehead rested against mine. "Stay," he said. "Move in. At least until this is settled. The guest room on the 3rd floor, it's yours. I'll have Lucia prepare it." "The 3rd floor?" I raised an eyebrow. "Where's your room?" "Also the 3rd floor. Different end of the hall." "That's very proper of you. I'm trying to maintain some semblance of boundaries while you're living under my roof, and technically still employed to care for my mother." But the heat in his eyes suggested boundaries were becoming increasingly theoretical. "What if I don't want boundaries?" His jaw clenched. "Hannah, if we cross that line, there's no going back to professional distance. You become mine in a way that goes beyond employment or protection. Are you ready for that?" The possessiveness in his tone should have alarmed me, but instead it sent heat through my body, want pooling low in my stomach. I'd spent 26 years playing it safe, being responsible, putting everyone else first. For once, I wanted to choose something purely for myself. Consequences be damned. "Yes," I said simply. Christopher's eyes darkened and he took my hand, leading me up the stairs to the 3rd floor, past the guest room he'd mentioned to a master suite at the far end that was all dark woods and masculine comfort. The door closed behind us, and then he was kissing me again, hands moving over my body with intent this time. No more careful restraint, and I gave myself over to it completely, to the heat and want, and the rightness of finally crossing this line we'd been dancing around for weeks. Later, lying tangled in his sheets with his arm around me and my head on his chest, listening to his heartbeat slow back to normal, I felt the weight of the choice I'd made. Moving in, sleeping with him, becoming his in the way he'd meant. It tied me to this world inextricably, but as his fingers traced idle patterns on my shoulder, and he pressed a kiss to the top of my head, I couldn't bring myself to regret it. "Tomorrow I'll have your things brought over," he said quietly, "and we'll need to have a conversation with Mama about you living here. Make sure she understands without getting confused. She'll be thrilled. She's been asking when I'm going to stay for dinner every night like family. You are family now." The certainty in his voice left no room for argument. Mine to protect, mine to care for. The Grecos want to test that? Let them. They'll learn exactly how far I'll go. The threat implicit in those words should have frightened me, but wrapped in his arms in the safety of his home, I found I trusted him to keep that promise, violence and all. I'd chosen this world, chosen him, and I'd face whatever came next with my eyes open and no regrets. Living in the Ravalini townhouse changed everything in ways both obvious and subtle. The morning routines became shared. Christopher and I passing each other in the hallway as he left for whatever business required his attention. Me heading downstairs to help Bianca with breakfast. Lucia adjusted to my permanent presence with efficiency that suggested she'd expected it all along, treating me with a deference that made me uncomfortable until I realized it wasn't about me personally, but about my relationship with Christopher. The tension with the Greco family escalated exactly as predicted. 2 days after I'd moved in completely, bringing the few possessions I owned from my apartment in Alston, Christopher received word that another shipment had been hit, this one significantly more valuable than the first. The response came in the form of closed-door meetings with Anthony and other men whose names I didn't know and didn't ask for, conversations conducted in voices too low for me to overhear even when I was in adjacent rooms. "It's going to get worse before it stabilizes," Anthony told me one afternoon when we were both keeping Bianca company in the sunroom. She'd fallen asleep in her chair, exhausted from a morning of confusion and agitation, and Anthony had appeared with the quiet assumption that watching over her was now a shared responsibility. Greco's pushing hard, testing boundaries. Christopher's been trying to handle it without direct retaliation, but there's a limit to how much territory he can lose before his own people start questioning his leadership. What would direct retaliation look like? I asked, not entirely sure I wanted the answer. Anthony gave me a look that suggested he was deciding how much honesty I could handle. Nothing you need details about. But Christopher's been different since you came into the picture. More measured, more careful about consequences. The old Christopher would have already burned down half of Greco's operations. This Christopher is trying to find solutions that don't involve body counts. Because of me. Because you make him want to be better than what this life usually requires. Whether that's sustainable long-term? We'll see. He checked his phone, frowning at whatever message he'd received. But right now, it's making things complicated. His men need to see strength. Greco needs to see consequences. And Christopher's trying to balance all of that with keeping you insulated from the worst of it. I thought about that conversation later that evening, when Bianca had her worst episode since I'd started working for the family. It began during dinner, which I'd been taking with her in the breakfast room, while Christopher met with associates in his study. One moment she was eating peacefully. The next she was standing abruptly, her chair falling backward with a crash that brought Lucia running. "They're here," Bianca gasped, backing toward the wall. "In the house, I can hear them. They've come to finish it, to kill us all like they killed my baby." I moved toward her slowly, keeping my voice calm. "Ma'am, no one's here except family. You're safe." But she was beyond hearing, lost in memories that were 5 years old, but playing out as present reality. She made for the door with surprising speed, and I followed, my heart sinking, as I realized she was heading toward Christopher's study, where the door was partially open, and I could see men gathered around the desk, papers spread out that probably contained information I shouldn't see. "Bianca, wait," I called, but she burst into the room before I could stop her. "Traditori," she screamed, the Italian word for traitors cutting through whatever conversation had been happening. "All of you, liars and killers, you promised protection and delivered death. You took my Sophia, my beautiful girl. You took her, and left me with nothing but blood and screaming." Christopher was on his feet immediately, his face a mask of control, even as I saw the pain flickering underneath, the guilt that never fully left him. The men around the desk had gone silent, clearly uncomfortable with this breach of the carefully maintained facade of business as usual. I stepped between Bianca and the men, blocking her view, forcing her to focus on me instead of whatever demons she was seeing. "Ma'am, look at me, just me. Do you know who I am?" Her eyes were wild, unfocused, but after a moment recognition flickered through. "Hannah?" "Yes, Hannah. And right now, you and I are going to go outside and look at the stars. Remember how you told me your grandmother used to point out constellations in Italy? Let's see if we can find them here." It was manipulation. using her love of her grandmother to redirect her attention. But it worked. The wildness in her eyes dimmed slightly, and she let me take her arm, let me guide her out of the study past Christopher, whose expression was grateful and devastated in equal measure. I took her to the back garden even though it was December and freezing. Wrapping her in a heavy coat I grabbed from the hall closet and settling her on the bench under the bare branches of the maple tree. The city lights obscured most stars, but a few were visible, and I pointed them out, making up stories about constellations I barely remembered from high school astronomy, anything to keep her focused on the present instead of the past. "I saw her die," Bianca said suddenly, her voice small and lost. "My Sophia. There was so much blood and I couldn't stop it, couldn't save her. I tried, but my hands were too small. There was too much blood. Tears streamed down her face and I pulled her close, letting her cry against my shoulder while my own throat went tight with sympathy. This was the trauma that had broken her mind, the moment that had triggered the rapid decline into Alzheimer's, and there was nothing I could do to fix it, only bear witness and provide comfort. Christopher found us there 20 minutes later, his meeting apparently concluded. He sat down on the other side of his mother, taking her hand in his, and the three of us stayed like that for a long time, bound together by grief and love, and circumstances none of us had chosen. Later, after Lucia had helped Bianca to bed and given her medication to help her sleep through the night without more episodes, Christopher and I stood in his study, surrounded by the evidence of the world he operated in. Maps marked with territories, financial documents that probably tracked illegal transactions, photographs of people I assumed were either associates or enemies. "I'm sorry you had to see that," he said quietly. "Both the episode with Mama and what's in this room. You don't need to protect me from reality, Christopher. I'm living in it now. Are you?" He turned to face me. "Because there are days when I wonder if you truly understand what being with me means long term. This life, these conflicts, they don't end. One Greco gets dealt with, and another threat emerges. It's constant warfare dressed up in business suits and polite negotiations that hide violence underneath. I know what I signed up for. Do you? Because tonight you saw Mama relive her worst trauma. That trauma exists because of what I do. Because of enemies I made through choices I can't unmake. Sophia died because someone wanted to hurt me. Mama's mind is fracturing because she witnessed it. And now you're here, in the line of fire. And if something happens to you because of me, I don't know if I can survive that guilt." I moved closer to him, taking his face in my hands. "Listen to me. What happened to Sophia was terrible and tragic and not your fault. You didn't pull that trigger. You didn't plan that attack. You were trying to protect your family, and sometimes protection fails, despite our best efforts. I watched my father die slowly over 3 years from cancer. I couldn't prevent or cure, and the guilt of not saving him nearly destroyed me. But eventually, I had to accept that some things are beyond our control. This is different. The threats to you are direct consequences of my choices, and my being here is a direct consequence of my choices. I chose to help your mother that night in the rain. I chose to take this job. I chose to stay when I learned the truth. I chose to move in here. Every step of the way, I made decisions with my eyes open. You don't get to take away my agency by assuming I don't understand the stakes." He pulled me against him, his arms wrapping around me tightly. "I'm going to end this situation with Greco, whatever it takes. I won't keep living with the threat of them targeting you. What does that mean exactly? It means I'm done trying to be measured and diplomatic. Anthony was right earlier. My restraint is being seen as weakness. Time to remind everyone why my family has controlled these territories for 3 generations. The cold certainty in his voice should have frightened me. But instead I felt a complicated mix of relief and dread. Relief that maybe the constant tension would resolve. Dread for what resolution would require. 3 days later, while I was reading to Bianca in the sunroom, Christopher received a call that changed his entire demeanor. I watched his face go carefully blank, then saw fury flash across it before control reasserted itself. When he hung up, he sat motionless for a long moment, before standing and finding me in the next room. "I need to go out," he said, his voice tightly controlled. "Lucia will be here with Mama, and there are 3 guards stationed around the house. You don't leave for any reason until I get back, understood? What happened? Greco made a mistake. A big one. I'm going to make sure he understands exactly how big. He kissed me hard, desperately, then left before I could ask more questions. He was gone for 6 hours. The longest 6 hours of my life. I stayed with Bianca, kept her calm and entertained. But my mind spun with possibilities, with fears I couldn't quite articulate. When Christopher finally returned, it was nearly midnight. His clothing was pristine, no signs of violence. But something in his eyes suggested he'd witnessed or participated in things he couldn't unsee. "Is it over?" I asked when he found me in his study where I'd been pretending to read while actually just waiting for him. "The acute phase is over. Greco's been arrested on charges that should keep him locked up for decades if the system works the way it's supposed to. Financial crimes, mostly. Evidence that mysteriously appeared in federal hands this afternoon. His second-in-command has already reached out to negotiate terms for peaceful coexistence going forward. You chose to go legal route instead of violent one. I chose the route that removes the threat permanently without adding to my body count. The FBI has been wanting to bring down Greco for years. They just needed evidence. I provided it. He moved to the bar and poured himself a drink, downing it in one swallow. It's not noble, Hannah. I'm not a good man just because I chose one method over another. I still destroyed a man's life and freedom to protect what's mine. What's yours being me and Bianca. And everyone else in this organization who would have been collateral damage if this had escalated to full warfare. But yes, primarily you and Mama. Everything I do starts from protecting you two. I went to him, wrapping my arms around him from behind, feeling the tension in his shoulders. Thank you for choosing the path with less bloodshed. I know it probably wasn't the easier choice politically. Anthony thinks I've gone soft. My captains are confused about why I didn't retaliate more directly. But I don't care what they think as long as you're safe. We stood like that for a long time, the weight of the past weeks finally lifting slightly. Though I knew from what Anthony had said that there would always be other threats, other conflicts. This life Christopher had inherited didn't offer exits, only temporary reprieves between crises. But for tonight, with his mother sleeping peacefully upstairs and the immediate threat neutralized, we could pretend that the world was simpler than it was, that love and protection were straightforward rather than complicated, that choices didn't carry consequences that rippled out in ways we couldn't always predict or control. Come to bed, I said quietly. Tomorrow will bring whatever it brings. Tonight we've earned some peace. He turned in my arms and kissed me, and whatever darkness he'd witnessed or participated in that day, he left it outside the bedroom door, choosing instead to be just a man with the woman he loved. Complications be damned. The next few days would test that fragile peace, would force us to confront realities we'd been avoiding. But for now we had this moment, and we took it gratefully. The peace that settled after Greco's arrest lasted exactly 4 days before shattering in the worst way possible. I was at a pharmacy 3 blocks from the townhouse, picking up a prescription for Bianca that needed to be refilled, accompanied by one of Christopher's security men whose name was James, a quiet professional who'd been shadowing me for weeks now. The pharmacy was one Christopher had approved, vetted for safety, in a neighborhood he controlled. I should have been safe. I should have been, but I wasn't. It happened so fast that I barely processed it until it was over. One moment I was at the counter waiting for the pharmacist to confirm the prescription details. The next, a van screeched to a stop outside, and 3 men rushed through the door. James moved immediately to intercept, but there were too many of them, and they knew exactly what they were doing. I heard a sound like a punch, saw James drop, and then hands were grabbing me, yanking me toward the door before I could scream. I fought, clawing and kicking and trying to make myself as difficult to move as possible. But they were professionals, and I was just a 26-year-old woman who'd never been in a real fight in my life. Someone pressed something cloth covered over my mouth and nose, chemical smell making my head swim. And then the world tilted sideways into darkness. When I woke, my head pounded, and my mouth tasted like copper and chemicals. I was sitting in a chair in what looked like an abandoned warehouse. Concrete floors and high ceilings and the smell of salt air suggesting we were somewhere near the water. My hands were zip-tied to the chair arms and my ankles were similarly bound. Panic clawed at my throat, but I forced it down, forced myself to breathe slowly and assess the situation. 3 men stood near a doorway about 20 feet away, speaking in voices too low for me to hear clearly. One of them noticed I was awake and said something that made the other 2 turn. The one who approached me was older, maybe 50, with graying hair and a face that suggested he smiled rarely, and meant it even less. "Miss Mitchell," he said, his voice carrying a slight accent I couldn't quite place. "I apologize for the rough treatment. My men were instructed to be careful with you, but speed was necessary. Who are you?" My voice came out shakier than I wanted it to. "My name is Nicholas Greco. I believe you've heard of me." Ice flooded my veins. Christopher had said Greco was in federal custody, that he'd been arrested on charges that would keep him locked up. But clearly intelligence had been wrong, or circumstances had changed, because he was very much here, and very much not in prison. "Christopher will come for me," I said, trying to project confidence I didn't feel. "I'm counting on it. That's rather the point of this exercise." Greco pulled over a metal folding chair and sat down across from me, close enough that I could see the cold calculation in his eyes. "You see, your Christopher made a significant error when he chose to use legal channels against me rather than traditional methods. He thought he was being clever, avoiding bloodshed while still removing me from the board. What he failed to anticipate was that I have resources he didn't account for, connections that ensured my release within hours of arrest. So you took me to what? Punish him? Kill me in retaliation? Kill you? No, Miss Mitchell. You're far more valuable alive. You're leverage, a bargaining chip to force Christopher Ravalini to acknowledge that his territory is no longer exclusively his, that he needs to share control or face consequences." He leaned back, studying me like I was an interesting specimen. "Though I must say, I'm curious what he sees in you. You're pretty enough, certainly. But you don't strike me as the type who'd normally appeal to someone of his position. Too ordinary, too middle class, too unconnected to be a strategic alliance. Maybe he likes that I'm not part of this world," I shot back, anger cutting through fear. "Perhaps. Or perhaps he's simply tired, and you represent escape from responsibilities he never wanted. Either way, you matter to him considerably based on how much he's invested in protecting you. That makes you extremely useful to me." Greco stood and pulled out a phone, typing something quickly. "I'm sending him proof of life. Photographic evidence that you're unharmed and in my custody. Within the hour, he'll receive terms for your release. If he's smart, he'll accept them, and we can all move forward. If he's prideful, well, then things become more complicated for everyone involved. You don't know him very well if you think he'll negotiate under these circumstances," I said, though I wasn't entirely sure that was true. Christopher had shown himself willing to make pragmatic choices over violent ones recently. Would he trade territory to get me back? Probably. Would that decision haunt him and undermine his authority? Definitely. "We'll see." Greco gestured to his men. "Make her comfortable. Food, water, untie her hands so she can eat. She's a guest, not a prisoner, until we determine otherwise." I was left alone after that, my hands freed though my ankles remained bound to the chair. One of the men brought me a bottle of water and a sandwich from somewhere, setting them on a crate within reach. The surreal normalcy of being offered lunch while kidnapped almost made me laugh, but I swallowed the hysterical sound and forced myself to eat because I needed my strength for whatever was coming. Hours passed. I had no way to track time exactly, but the light coming through high windows shifted from afternoon to evening to darkness. No one spoke to me directly, though I overheard fragments of conversations in Italian and English, enough to understand that Christopher had received the proof of life and had responded, though not in the way Greco expected. "He's not negotiating," one of the men said, sounding nervous. "He's threatening full-scale war if we don't release her immediately." "Let him threaten," Greco replied calmly. "He won't start a war that could get her killed. He cares too much." But Greco didn't know Christopher the way I was starting to. Christopher would absolutely start a war if he thought it was the only way to get me back safely. The question was how much time I had before that war arrived at this warehouse. The answer came sooner than I expected. Just past what I guessed was midnight based on how deeply dark it had become outside, I heard sounds in the distance. Shouts, then gunfire, brief and sharp. Greco's men scrambled to defensive positions, weapons appearing from nowhere, and I was suddenly very aware of how exposed I was, tied to a chair in the middle of a space that was about to become a battlefield. "Move her to the back room," Greco ordered, and 2 men grabbed my chair, carrying me awkwardly through a doorway into a smaller space with no windows. They left me there in darkness, punctuated only by the sounds of the assault happening somewhere nearby. The gunfire intensified, closer now, and I heard voices shouting commands in English and Italian. Then the door to my room burst open and I flinched, expecting Greco's men or worse. But instead it was Christopher, flanked by Anthony and 3 others I didn't recognize. Christopher's face when he saw me was something I'd never forget. Relief and fury and fear all fighting for dominance. He crossed to me in 3 strides, pulling a knife from somewhere and cutting the zip ties binding me to the chair. His hands shook slightly as he checked me for injuries, his touch gentle despite the violence happening around us. "Are you hurt? Did they touch you?" "I'm okay. Scared, but okay." "How did you find me so fast?" "I always know where you are." He helped me stand, my legs unsteady from hours of sitting. "There's a tracker in your phone, another in your watch, a third in the sole of your shoe." The moment James didn't check in, I knew something was wrong and activated all of them. "That's excessive. That's what kept you alive long enough for me to get here." He pulled me against him briefly, then released me to Anthony. "Get her to the car. I need to finish this." "Christopher, no," I started, but he was already moving back toward the main warehouse space where I could still hear sounds of conflict. Anthony's hand on my arm was firm. "Come on. He needs to know you're safe before he can focus on cleaning this up." I let Anthony lead me out through a side exit where several black SUVs were waiting, engines running. He put me in the back of one and climbed in beside me, and within seconds we were pulling away from the warehouse. I twisted in my seat, looking back at the building we were leaving behind, where Christopher was still dealing with Greco and his men in whatever way he deemed necessary. "Is he going to kill them?" I asked quietly. Anthony was silent for a moment. "Probably not all of them. But Greco? After this, Christopher won't make the mistake of leaving him alive to be a threat again." The certainty in his voice should have horrified me. But instead, I just felt numb. I'd been kidnapped and held for hours because of Christopher's world, because of what he was, and what his enemies saw as acceptable tactics. The reality of that life, of the constant danger, of the violence that lurked just underneath polite business transactions, crashed over me in waves. When we arrived back at the townhouse, Lucia was waiting, her face pale but composed. She took one look at me and immediately ushered me upstairs, running a bath and laying out clean clothes and treating me with gentle efficiency that suggested she'd dealt with this kind of aftermath before. "Mrs. Bianca?" I asked, suddenly terrified that something had happened to her during all this. "Sleeping peacefully. She doesn't know anything happened. Mr. Ravalini made sure the house was extra secured before he went after you. And James is alive. They got him to surgery in time, and the doctors think he'll pull through." I soaked in the bath until the water went cold, trying to wash away the fear and helplessness and chemical smell from whatever they'd used to knock me out. When I finally emerged, wrapped in a robe Lucia had left, Christopher was in the bedroom waiting, pacing like a caged predator. He stopped when he saw me, his expression unreadable. "I'm sorry." "For what?" "For this being your life now. For you being taken because of me. For the fact that I just killed 3 men and severely injured 5 others to get you back." He moved closer. "For the reality that this won't be the last time someone tries to use you against me." I studied his face, seeing the blood spatter he'd missed on his collar, the strain around his eyes, the way his hands clenched and unclenched like he was trying to release tension that wouldn't leave. "Did you kill Greco?" "No. I wanted to, but I made a different choice." He sat down heavily on the edge of the bed. "I beat him severely. Made sure he understood the consequences of touching you. Then I called the FBI back and gave them even more evidence. Enough that this time there's no bail, no early release, no possibility of him getting out. He'll die in prison, which is a worse fate than a quick death would have been. The new charges, combined with his history and the way he violated every previous condition, mean there's no more bail, no more deals, no loophole for him to slip through. You chose the harder path again. I chose the path that doesn't make me more of a monster than I already am in your eyes. He looked up at me. I saw your face tonight, Hannah, when I cut you free. You were terrified, not just of Greco, but of everything, of this whole life. I don't blame you for wanting to walk away after this. I moved to stand in front of him, taking his face in my hands and forcing him to look at me. I was terrified. I still am. But not of you, Christopher. Never of you. This life? Yes. It's frightening and dangerous, and tonight proved that in ways I can't ignore. But you came for me. You mobilized everything you had to find me and get me back safely. That's what I'm choosing to focus on. Even knowing this could happen again, even knowing that, I kissed him softly. I'm not naive anymore about what being with you means. Tonight stripped away any illusions I had left. But it also showed me exactly how far you'll go to protect the people you love, and I'd rather face danger with you than safety without you. He pulled me against him, holding me so tightly it almost hurt. I love you. I should have said it before now, but I'm saying it now. I love you, Hannah, and I will burn down the entire city before I let anyone take you from me again. I love you too. The words came easily, truthfully, despite everything, and we're going to figure out how to navigate this life together. Starting with you teaching me basic self-defense so I'm not completely helpless next time. There won't be a next time. You can't promise that, but you can promise to prepare me better. To trust me enough to let me be a partner in this instead of just something to be protected. He pulled back to look at me. Something shifting in his expression. You're remarkable, you know that? Most people would run screaming after what you went through tonight. Most people didn't fall in love with a mob boss while caring for his mother. I managed a small smile. I'm apparently not most people. No, he agreed, kissing me again. You're absolutely not. We stayed like that for a long time, holding each other in the quiet of his bedroom while the adrenaline slowly faded and exhaustion took its place. Outside, Anthony and the security team were cleaning up the mess, ensuring the situation was truly resolved. Downstairs, Bianca slept peacefully, unaware of the crisis that had unfolded. And in this room, Christopher and I clung to each other, having survived another test of what our relationship could withstand. Scarred, but not broken. Frightened, but committed to facing whatever came next together. 3 months after the kidnapping, life had settled into a new rhythm that felt both familiar and strange. The trauma had left marks we didn't talk about much, nightmares I had occasionally that would wake Christopher from his careful sleep beside me, moments when I'd panic if I couldn't immediately locate an exit in a new space. But we'd worked through it together, with the help of a therapist Christopher had vetted thoroughly, someone who specialized in trauma and understood the unique constraints of our situation without judgment. Bianca's condition had deteriorated noticeably in those months. The stress of Christopher's increased tension and my own subdued presence apparently affecting her more than we'd realized. She had fewer good days now, more confusion, more moments where she didn't recognize me or thought I was Sophia or someone from her distant past. The doctors had adjusted her medications, but everyone acknowledged we were fighting a losing battle. Alzheimer's was progressive and irreversible, and all we could do was make her comfortable and ensure she felt loved through the decline. Christopher had changed too, in ways both visible and subtle. He'd started the process of transitioning some of his operations, moving money and investments into legitimate businesses, real estate developments, tech startups, venture capital. It was gradual, the kind of generational shift that would take years to complete fully. But the intention was clear. He wanted a life that wouldn't constantly endanger the people he loved, a legacy that didn't require his children, whenever they came, to inherit a world of violence and threat. You're doing this because of what happened to me, I said one evening, as we reviewed documents in his study, paperwork for a new investment in a clean energy company that was entirely above board. I'm doing this because I want a future that doesn't end with me in prison, or dead before I'm 50, he replied. The kidnapping just crystallized what I'd been thinking about for a while. This life my grandfather built, that my father maintained. It made sense in their time, but the world's different now. Law enforcement is more sophisticated. The old territorial boundaries don't hold the way they used to. Adapting or dying, and I choose to adapt. Your people must have opinions about this shift. Some do. Anthony supports it, thinks it's smart long-term planning. Others are less enthusiastic, prefer the old ways, but I'm still in charge, and they'll follow or they'll find themselves working for someone else. He set down the pen he'd been using to sign documents and pulled me into his lap. Besides, I have reasons to want a future that extends beyond the next territorial dispute. Reasons that involve you, and potentially a family, eventually. The casual mention of family made my heart skip. We'd been careful about birth control, both of us aware that bringing children into this world while it was still as dangerous as it had been would be irresponsible. But the idea that Christopher was actively planning for a time when that calculation might change felt significant. Eventually, I agreed, kissing him softly. When things are more stable, and your mother's situation has resolved one way or another. Bianca's decline hung over us like a shadow we didn't acknowledge directly, but both felt constantly. She was 64, not ancient, but the Alzheimer's was aggressive, and the trauma that had triggered it had done damage that couldn't be undone. The doctors had started conversations about what her final months might look like, about care options and pain management, and difficult decisions we'd have to make. Christopher proposed on a Tuesday afternoon in February, 5 months after I'd first helped his lost mother on that rainy street that felt like a lifetime ago now. We were in the garden despite the cold, Bianca wrapped in blankets and sitting between us on the bench, having one of her increasingly rare moments of complete lucidity. She'd been telling stories about Christopher as a boy, making him laugh with embarrassing anecdotes about his attempts to impress girls in middle school, when suddenly she turned to me with perfect clarity in her eyes. "You love my son," she said in Italian. "I do," I replied in the same language. "Very much. And he loves you. I can see it in how he looks at you, how he is when you're near. You've made him softer, better." She took my hand in her frail one. "Sophia would have liked you. She always wanted Christopher to find someone who saw past the family business to the man underneath. I wish I could have met her. She's watching, I think. Somewhere. And she approves." Bianca turned to Christopher, switching to English. "You should marry this girl before she realizes she can do better." Christopher laughed, but there was emotion underneath it. "Mama, that's not very romantic proposal advice. Romance is for young people. I'm old and dying. I can be practical." She squeezed both our hands. "Marry her, Christopher. Build a life that honors Sophia's memory by being different than what killed her. And give me grandbabies before I forget who they are." The bluntness of it, the acknowledgement of her own decline delivered with such matter-of-fact acceptance, made my throat tight. Christopher's hand tightened on mine, and I saw him struggling with his own emotions. "I was planning to ask her, Mama. Just waiting for the right moment. This is the right moment. I'm here, I'm lucid, and I want to see you do it properly." Bianca looked at me with a small smile. "He bought a ring 3 weeks ago. It's in his desk drawer, third from the left, under the files about the shipping contracts. I saw it when I was looking for stamps." "Mama," Christopher said with exasperation and affection, "you're ruining my surprise. I'm ensuring I'm present for it. There's a difference." She settled back against the bench. "Now ask her before I fall asleep or forget what we're talking about." Christopher stood and pulled me up with him, and I realized his hands were shaking slightly, nervous in a way I'd never seen him. He didn't have the ring with him. It was apparently where Bianca had said, but he got down on one knee anyway right there in the frozen garden with his mother watching. "Hannah Mitchell, you walked into my life by helping someone you didn't know, showing kindness when everyone else just walked past. You've stayed despite learning truths that would send most people running. You've loved my mother and dealt with my world, and survived being kidnapped because of me. You've made me want to be better than what I was raised to be." His dark eyes held mine with intensity that made everything else fade away. "I love you more than I thought I was capable of loving anyone. Will you marry me?" "Yes," I said. The answer immediate and certain despite all the complications that came with it. "Yes, absolutely yes." He stood and kissed me, while Bianca applauded weakly from the bench. And for that perfect moment, everything was simple and right, and full of hope for a future we'd build together. We married 6 months later in a small ceremony at the townhouse. Just immediate family and Christopher's closest associates. Anthony served as best man, Bianca as my honorary matron of honor, despite needing Lucia's support to stand through the brief ceremony. We spoke our vows in the same garden where Christopher had proposed, on a perfect June afternoon with flowers blooming and sunlight making everything feel possible. Bianca cried through the entire ceremony, and afterwards during the small reception, she had a moment of clarity that let her toast us in Italian, welcoming me officially to the family and blessing our marriage with words that had been passed down through generations of Ravalini women. It was the last fully coherent thing she said. Her decline accelerated rapidly after that, as if she'd been holding on specifically to see Christopher settled. Within weeks, she rarely recognized us, spent most of her time sleeping or staring at nothing, her vibrant personality fading into confusion and silence. The doctors moved her to hospice care at home, making the sunroom into a comfortable space where she could be surrounded by family, even as she slipped away from us. I sat with her every day, reading to her in Italian even when I wasn't sure she could hear or understand, holding her hand and telling her about Christopher and our plans and how much she'd meant to me. Christopher would join me in the evenings, sitting on her other side, speaking quietly about his day and his memories of her and Sophia, saying things he probably should have said years ago, but was finally brave enough to voice now. She died on a Thursday morning in early September, peacefully in her sleep with both of us beside her. Christopher held her hand and cried silently while I held him. And we stayed like that for a long time before finally calling Lucia to help us with what came next. The funeral was larger than the wedding had been, attended by family from Italy, business associates, people from the neighborhood who'd known the Ravalini family for generations. Christopher delivered a eulogy in Italian that had half the attendees crying, talking about his mother's strength and love, and how she'd survived her husband's death and her daughter's murder, and still managed to find joy in small moments. He talked about how meeting me had given her happiness in her final years, someone new to love who loved her back. In the weeks after, the house felt emptier, despite my presence. Christopher threw himself into work, specifically into accelerating the legitimate business transitions he'd started. Greco's imprisonment had created a power vacuum that other families were trying to fill. But Christopher had used the opportunity to broker peace agreements and territorial understandings that reduced conflict significantly. He was building the foundation for a different kind of empire, one that could operate openly rather than in shadows. 2 years and a few months after Bianca's death, I discovered I was pregnant. We'd been trying for about 6 months, had finally felt stable and secure enough to bring a child into our complicated world. Christopher's reaction when I told him was pure joy mixed with terror, immediately starting to plan increased security and baby-proofing and approximately 1,000 things that didn't need to be decided in the first trimester. "We're having twins," I told him at the 20-week ultrasound, watching his face cycle through shock and delight and renewed terror. "A boy and a girl. Twins," he repeated faintly. "Of course we are. Nothing about our life can be simple." But his hand gripped mine tightly, and when the ultrasound tech printed out images of our children, he stared at them with wonder that made my heart full. I was 8 months pregnant, uncomfortable and massive, and counting down days until delivery, when Christopher came home one evening with news that he'd been building toward for 2 years. "It's done," he said, pulling me gently into his arms despite my awkward size. "The last of the illegal operations have been sold or shut down. The Ravalini organization is officially a legitimate business empire as of today. Real estate, tech investments, venture capital, all above board and legal. How do your people feel about that?" Some retired, took their cuts and walked away. Others adapted, learned new skills, moved into the legal businesses. Anthony's now officially my chief operating officer instead of my consigliere. And he's actually enjoying the challenge of legitimate business. He rested his hand on my swollen belly where one of the twins was currently kicking enthusiastically. "Our children will inherit a fortune built on questionable foundations, but maintained through legal means. That's the best I can give them. That's more than most people in your position would have managed," I said honestly. "You chose to change, to be different. That matters." The twins arrived 3 weeks later, exactly on my due date. A boy we named Carlo after Christopher's father, and a girl we named Sophia after his sister. Holding them both for the first time, Seeing Christopher's face as he cradled his daughter with tears streaming down his face, I felt the weight of everything we'd survived to get to this moment. We'd started with a chance encounter on a rainy street. A lost woman and a stranger who stopped to help. That choice had led to this. To a family built on love that had survived violence and danger and loss. To children who would grow up knowing their father had once been something darker, but had chosen to become something better. To a life that wasn't perfect or simple but was ours, earned through difficult choices and unwavering commitment. Christopher looked up from Sophia to meet my eyes, Carlo sleeping peacefully in my arms, and smiled with genuine happiness that transformed his usually serious face. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For what?" "For seeing me that night, really seeing me, and choosing to stay despite everything you learned. For loving my mother and giving her joy in her final years. For surviving being kidnapped, and still choosing this life with me. For these children, this family, this future I never thought I'd have." He leaned over to kiss me softly. "For being brave enough to help a lost woman in the rain and changing absolutely everything." "Best decision I ever made," I replied, and meant it completely. Our story didn't end there, of course. Life continued with all its complications and challenges, raising twins while Christopher navigated the complex world of legitimate business, built on a foundation everyone knew, but rarely mentioned. The past due notices that had once covered my tiny kitchen counter were gone. Every bill tied to my father's care had been paid in full long ago, replaced by grocery lists and pediatric appointment reminders. But we faced it together, partners in every sense, building something worthwhile from the ashes of what had been. And sometimes, on rainy October evenings when the twins were asleep and the house was quiet, Christopher and I would stand at the window and remember that night, when everything changed, when kindness and gratitude and choice had led us to each other and to this complicated, beautiful life we'd created together.